Hey there, welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. For this video, I will be once again revisiting Intel's wallet-friendly Pentium G4560 processor. And if you missed it last week, I did already check this processor out and I compared it against the Core i3, i5 and i7 processors in well over a dozen games at 1080p and 1440p. The key to that benchmark video was the use of multiple different graphics cards. For testing each CPU, I did use the GeForce GTX 1050 Ti, GTX 1060 and GTX 1080. This gave us a really good idea of how these CPUs game when paired with different tiered GPUs, and the results were very interesting. The feedback I received from that video was overwhelmingly positive, so a big thank you to everyone who offered support. The only negative, or rather constructive, criticism that I received had to do with the lack of AMD GPUs used for testing, and I get that. The reason I went with the 1050 Ti, 1060 and 1080 is because they're all current generation products that cover a number of different performance segments. Testing with, say, the RX 460, RX 480 and Fury X, for example, just wouldn't have provided the same range of performance. The Fury X really is the weakness here. Throwing in the RX 480 or RX 470 along with the Nvidia-based GPUs would have made for far more results than I can show on the screen. That said, I agree as the best sub $200 GPU, testing the RX 470 really is a must. Therefore, I've gone back and tested the RX 470 with the G4560, as well as the Core i3, i5 and i7 processors. The GTX 1080 has been dropped from the results to make way for the RX 470, which will be compared alongside the previously tested GTX 1050 Ti and 1060. For now, the G4560 looks to be by far the best entry-level CPU available, so pairing it with what we believe to be the best sub-$200 GPU in the RX 470 should make for the ultimate gaming combo. That said, many of you did express concerns in regards to AMD's DirectX 11 driver overhead, and feared this could be an issue for the G4560, so let's find out. Right away we get off to a bit of a rocky start with Rise of the Tomb Raider. Here the G4560 really struggled with the RX 470 installed. Although the average frame rate looks good, the performance was very stuttery, and this is evident by that very low 22 FPS minimum. This test was run half a dozen times, and every time the minimum frame rate was very low. Bumping the resolution up to 1440p didn't really help out the G4560 with the RX 470, and again we see horribly low minimum frame rates. This is a really bad start, but as you're about to see, it's far from the norm, and I'm still not clear why the combo struggled so much in Rise of the Tomb Raider. Previously we found that Cry Primal wasn't at all CPU intensive, and this is again true when using the RX 470. We saw the same 44 FPS minimum and 55 FPS average across all 4 CPUs tested. The 1440p results were again much the same. The G4560 does fall 1 FPS behind the other processors with the RX 470, though that figure is of course well within the margin of error. The division can be quite CPU intensive at times, but even so, the RX 470 provides similar performance to that of the GTX 1060 when paired with the Pentium G4560 at 1080p. Again, we find much the same when looking at the 1440p results. Here the G4560 was able to max out the RX 470. The G4560 performed well in Hitman when paired with the RX 470, and here we see similar margins to the GTX 1060 results. The Core i5 and i7 processors do deliver better performance at 1080p, but with the G4560 averaging 60 FPS and staying above 50 FPS, the performance was very acceptable. A heavy GPU bottleneck can be seen at 1440p, and here the G4560 is able to match or at least roughly match the more expensive processors when paired with both the RX 470 and GTX 1060 graphics cards. The Pentium G4560 wasn't quite powerful enough to fully utilise the GTX 1060 in Quantum Break at 1080p, as it fell down to 62 FPS at times. That said, this processor was much more competitive with the RX 470 in this title, as the minimum frame rate was just 5% lower than that of the Core i5 and Core i7 processors. Oddly, at 1440p, the G4560 did fall away a bit more with the RX 470 in relation to the Core i5 and Core i7 processors, and here it was 10% slower when comparing the minimum frame rate. The RX 470 looks to be the perfect pairing for the G4560 in Overwatch. Here the budget combo never dipped below 100 FPS while providing an average of 134 FPS. That made the G4560 just 9% slower than the Core i7 6700K for both the minimum and average frame rates. The 1440p results are a bit interesting because all 4 CPUs were able to max out the GTX 1060. The same wasn't true for the slower RX 470. That said, the margins weren't exactly significant and the G4560 still remained very competitive. The G4560 performed very well with the RX 470 in Doom, though we do know this to be a primarily GPU intensive title. Still, the results at 1080p were impressive, and it was great to see the G4560/RX 470 combo pushing over 130 FPS at all times. Interestingly, this is the second time we've seen the G4560 and RX 470 combo fall away slightly more at 1440p. Again, the margin wasn't significant, but this was still unexpected. The Total War Warhammer results are very interesting indeed. Here we find that not only the G4560, but also the Core i3 7350K and Core i5 7600K performed better with the RX 470 than they did with the GTX 1060. The G4560 gains were particularly large, with the minimum frame rate 25% higher with the RX 470. Moving to 1440p provides mixed results. Here the G4560 still played best with the RX 470 despite a lower average frame rate. That is of course down to the fact that the minimum frame rate was 14% higher. Meanwhile, the Core i3, i5 and i7 processors deliver similar performance with both GPUs. The G4560 was fast enough to max out the RX 470 and Mirror's Edge Catalyst at 1080p, matching the 54 FPS minimum and 64 FPS average of the other processors tested. As expected, we find the same is true at 1440p. Here the G4560 averaged 41 FPS with a 36 FPS minimum, allowing it to match the other CPUs tested. Interestingly, the G4560 again played better with the RX 470 than it did with the GTX 1060, this time in F1 2016. The minimum frame rate was a whopping 19% greater, while the average was also 18% greater. These are very surprising results, but it's great news for the G4560 and the RX 470 combo. Increasing the resolution to 1440p, we find similar results between the RX 470 and GTX 1060 when paired with the G4560. Overall, Intel's new budget dual-core performed very well here. The Deus Ex Mankind Divided margins are similar when using the G4560 with either the RX 470 or GTX 1060. Of course, we are using a low-level API here, so these results are pretty much what we were expecting to find. Moving to 1440p, the RX 470 is completely maxed out using the very high quality settings, and this meant the G4560 matched the other three processors tested. The G4560 was 7% slower than the Core i3 processor when paired with the GeForce GTX 1060 in Battlefield 1. The margin was extended to 12% with the RX 470, and the dual-core Pentium processor dropped to 53 FPS. Bumping the resolution up to 1440p neutralized the performance advantage of the more expensive Intel processors when using the RX 470. Here all four tested processors averaged 57 FPS with a 48 FPS minimum. Testing the Mafia III shows the G4560 maxing out the RX 470 at 1080p with a minimum of 36 FPS and an average of 42 FPS. Jumping to 1440p provides similar results, and here the RX 470 dips down to 25 FPS on all four CPUs. Gears of War 4 is a very CPU demanding game, and here the G4560 was found to be 17% slower than the Core i7 processor when using the RX 470. That said, it was 30% slower when paired with the GTX 1060, so a definite improvement then. Moving to 1440p, the G4560 was pretty well able to get the most out of the RX 470 with an average of 47 FPS and a minimum of 39 FPS. The Pentium G4560 performed very well when testing with Titanfall 2, and at 1080p it was roughly able to match the other CPUs tested. This was also true at 1440p. Here the G4560 and RX 470 combo averaged 64 FPS with a 57 FPS minimum. The G4560 delivered similar performance with the RX 470 as it did when paired with the GTX 1060 in Civilization 6. This made it a good bit slower than the other processors tested despite still delivering playable performance. Even at 1440p, the G4560 lags behind. That said, with the RX 470 installed, the minimum frame rate didn't take the same hit, only dropping down to 37 FPS. The RX 470 and G4560 combo performed well when testing with Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, and here it wasn't a great deal slower than the Core i5 and Core i7 processors. Those margins seen at 1080p were eliminated at 1440p, and here all four processors allowed for 49 FPS minimum with a 52 FPS average. Okay, so we're done and dusted. 17 games from 2016 now tested. Nothing else to see then. I almost forgot Grand Theft Auto 5. Due to popular demand, I have updated the results with this 2-year-old title, and I have to admit it makes sense given not just how popular the game is, but also how CPU demanding it is. Using the high quality settings with MSAA and advanced graphical options disabled, we were for the most part removing any GPU bottlenecks. Therefore, if you were to crank up the visual quality settings a bit more, these margins would likely be reduced. What's key to note here is that with any of the 3 GPU configurations tested, the G4560 provided smooth playable performance and frame rates never dipped below 60 FPS. Jumping to 1440p, we can see that the margins within the dual-core and quad-core processors is slightly reduced. Again, the G4560 allowed for at least 60 FPS at all times. The Pentium G4560 and RX 470 look to be a match made in heaven for budget PC gamers. The combo costs just $235 US or 360 Aussie, and that enables some very impressive 1080p gaming performance, and honestly 1440p performance is also on the table. So let's take a look at how the G4560 compares with the RX 470, the GTX 1060 and the GTX 1050 Ti. Here we can see that the G4560 dropped just 5% when going from the GTX 1060 to the RX 470. Meanwhile, it was 24% faster with the RX 470 when compared to the GTX 1050 Ti. Now when compared to the Core i5-7600K for example, the G4560 was 20% slower when compared with the GTX 1060. That said, that margin was slightly reduced with the RX 470 down to 17%. So the i5-7600K is clearly able to get quite a bit more out of the RX 470 in these CPU intensive titles. That said, priced at almost 4 times more, it's not exactly a significant loss for the budget dual-core processor. Anyway, what we are seeing here is without question the worst case scenario for the G4560 when paired with either the RX 470 or GTX 1060 graphics cards. So then, what do these results look like if we compare the minimum frame rates from all 18 games tested, as in not excluding those GPU limited titles such as Cry Primal for example? Including the non-CPU intensive games doesn't significantly change the picture, but it does reduce the margin between the G4560 and the higher end Core i5 and i7 processors as we expected. With the RX 470 handling the rendering work, the G4560 is now just 13% slower than the Core i5-7600K. The G4560 might not have quite enough grunt to fully utilise the RX 470 in every game out there, but even where it struggles, we still received perfectly playable performance, in almost every title anyway. In fact, the only exception was Rise of the Tomb Raider out of the 18 games tested, and I'm still not quite sure what the issue there is. Anyway, bang for your buck, when it comes to new PC hardware, nothing in my opinion beats the G4560 and RX 470 combo. Hopefully you lot are happy with the testing that's been done here, and by adding those GTA 5 results, that'll get me out of trouble. If so, consider hitting the like button and maybe even sharing this video. I'm your host Steve, and I'll catch you for another big benchmark video really soon.